It's hard to believe, but the holiday season is coming up again. At Quince, you can find all you need for the season. Sweaters, coats, holiday outfits, and everyday essentials. I just ordered a new sweater from Quince, a Mongolian cashmere full-zip hoodie. It will look great with black pants for holiday events, and it will keep me warm and cozy all winter. Your holiday shopping is a breeze with Quince because it has something for everyone. I love to save myself hassle by shopping online, and Quince has free shipping and 365-day returns, just in case you need to return something. Quince delivers luxury quality pieces at half the price of similar brands because they cut out the middleman and partner directly with top-tier ethical factories. Step into the holiday season with layers made to feel good, look polished, and last from Quince. Perfect for gifting or keeping for yourself. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada, too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
What happens after something bad has happened, so violations? We focus on whether or not someone's going to apologize or not. And we have complete blinders quite often regarding this question of why did it happen? And it gets to the fact that most violations are not so clear-cut. There can be shades of gray. You can see the same incident as a matter of competence or as a matter of integrity. And many violations are multiply determined, so they can contain elements of both competence and integrity.
That was Peter Kim on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey, listeners, you know the podcast is values-based work for us and a labor of love. The podcast industry has been a roller coaster ride, and there are some expenses involved in hosting a podcast. We'd love to keep bringing you great episodes, and we could use your support. Help us keep the podcast going next year and beyond. You can do that 2 ways. You can support us on Patreon. For just $5 a month on Patreon, you'll be able to listen to the podcast ad-free. Or show us your love by making a one-time donation in any amount on Buy Me a Coffee. Think of it as taking a co-host out to coffee to thank us for the podcast. You can link to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee accounts on our website, offtheclockpsych.com. And if you're already supporting us, then thank you. We appreciate it. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode for our co-host discussion of today's interview.
Today, I'm talking with Dr. Peter Kim, who has spent 2 decades scientifically studying what happens when trust goes sideways. And his work demonstrates not only that saying, "I'm sorry," isn't always the magic fix we hope it will be, but it helps us to understand why. Peter is a professor at USC's Marshall School of Business, where he teaches some of the most popular MBA courses around, probably because everybody wants to know why their apologies keep backfiring. His research on trust violation and repair has won international and national awards and has been featured everywhere from New York Times to NPR, and culminated in his 2023 book, How Trust Works: The Science of How Relationships Are Built, Broken, and Repaired, which won the Academy of Management's Distinguished Winner Award for making significant contributions to both science and practice. Peter, welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited as I just think your work is particularly timely and so relevant for all of us in our daily relationships as well as our larger societal relationships. So I want to start with this paradox of trust, and then we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts. But you write that in the absence of any trust, cooperation becomes almost impossible. we would spend all our time monitoring and trying to protect ourselves from others. But trusting inherently makes us vulnerable. And for somebody who's been betrayed, whether in a relationship, workplace, or friendship, it's hard to decide to stay vulnerable, which would imply deciding to trust the person who has violated you. So how do you think about this paradox that we can't function without trust, but deciding to trust makes us inherently vulnerable?
So the paradox is something that I think we're all struggling with quite a bit today. And you see this in national polls. If you look at surveys of how we feel about one another, or in the government, or in other kinds of institutions, or in our leaders, every single poll I've seen has indicated that trust has declined. There are also glimmers, though. For example, the Pew Research Center surveys that indicate that trust should be improved. It should be better. And it's for precisely the reason that you identified, that if we lack trust, there's simply no way we can navigate the world. We would spend all our time worried about being taken advantage of or assaulted or, all these horrible things happening to us. We become paralyzed. So the focus nowadays, especially with all these news stories, is about how trust has been violated. And I'm sure we all have our own personal experiences that. But what we know from the research is that trust is a good thing. When you have trust, there's better coordination, there's better cooperation, there's communication. All the things that you need to interact with other people are improved. And there's also evidence that indicates that people who tend to trust, who are disposed to trust, wind up better off. They're not the gullible people in the world. They're the people who flourish because they are considered highly desirable partners for both trusting and non-trusting counterparts. So there are benefits.
And we'll talk a little bit about some of the wisdom of how to navigate that minefield more effectively, because it is tricky, right? If you're somebody who wants to trust, but there is a sense that you might be harmed if you're not careful about your trust, or if you resume trusting somebody who has shown that they're maybe not as trustworthy as you'd like them to be. But let's just back up for a second. And, we throw the word trust around all the time, but it's a surprisingly slippery word. And you've spent so many years really being careful about identifying and operationalizing what exactly you mean by what trust is. So I wonder if you can share with us how you define it in your research, and whether there are things that people commonly mistake for trust that actually aren't trust.
Absolutely. So this isn't work that I've done myself. It's work that I draw upon to inform what I do. But the concept of trust has been effectively defined in the past few decades as a willingness to make oneself vulnerable in situations involving risk. So there's a psychological willingness. So it's not just behavior. And it also entails that some risk is there. And this is where this definition, although complicated, helps differentiate trust from a lot of things that we might associate with trust. So you might cooperate with someone. You might act as if you trust someone in many situations. So we can focus on behavior as an indicator of whether trust exists. But there are many occasions in which we might act as if we trust others, even though we don't. If we believe that there's sufficient guardrails that will prevent that person from acting upon their inclinations, even though we think they have bad inclinations, that might be enough for us to act as if they are trustworthy. And if we have no other options, right? If they are our only choice, and that might also encourage us to engage with that person. But that's very different from the idea that, hey, we know this person could take advantage of us, and we're willing to make ourselves vulnerable to that possibility because we believe that even though they could. And so it really is that psychological assessment of the situation that matters. And it also entails that we should differentiate things that improve trust from things that mitigate risk, right? So a lot of things are put in the world to help keep us safe, but that doesn't necessarily reduce trust. It just reduces the likelihood that something bad will happen to us. So, in fact, there's evidence that indicates that the more of those safeguards that you put in place, the less trust there is. Because if someone cooperates in a situation where those safeguards are in place, then you attribute that behavior to those safeguards rather than to the idea that that person's trustworthy. So again, that's why we need some level of vulnerability there and a willingness to expose ourselves to that in that situation.
So I was really struck by reading in your book and hearing you talk about this idea that like we can sort of look like we trust, but that's not what you mean by trust. You're talking about a psychological process of like, am I willing to sort of make myself more vulnerable in this relationship because I'm giving up control and I'm trusting you to sort of do right by me. That's different than saying, sure, I trust you. And like, yes, we can do this project together. It's deeper than, and the other point that you're making really gets to what self-determination theory, I think, also talks about, this idea that if we sort of rely on the external motivators for somebody to behave in a trustworthy way, that it undermines the intrinsic motivation and our faith in the intrinsic motivation. So now I'm kind of throwing around a lot of jargon right now, but it's this idea that if I'm sort of forcing you to behave in a way, it doesn't make me feel very confident in your fundamental integrity as a person, because I'm saying you're not doing it because you want to behave in a moral, ethical way. You're doing it because you have no other option.
Yeah, I love your reference to self-determination theory because it really touches on the fact that we are trying to explain the events around us, and one very clear decision that we need to make is, to what extent does something happen because of that person, or to what extent did it happen because of the situation? And whatever pressures or constraints might have been imposed on that person. And so we're always trying to make that determination. Quite often we do it rather poorly, but we could get into that later.
Yeah, well, let's get into that, because this is so important and gets to your central framework, which I think is so fascinating and brings upon a lot of realizations that are a little bit disheartening. So let's talk about that. You have this framework of understanding trust violations in two different categories: integrity or competence. So I wonder if you can talk us through how to understand that framework. What are the different kinds of trust violations? And then maybe we'll talk about the social perception piece and how we can make mistakes in that.
Sure. Trust has been unpacked quite a bit in the past few years. So it's not a simple concept as like that most of us tend to assume. We either trust them or not. And, it's like a large volume now. It's comprised of a variety of assessments. And psychologists have identified as many as 10 different bases of trust. But I think that the most parsimonious assessment is that it's comprised of 3 different bases. Competence: are they able to do what you hope that they will do? Integrity: did they share your values? Will they adhere to principles you consider acceptable? And 3, benevolence: are they looking out for you in particular? Turns out integrity and benevolence tend to be pretty highly correlated. And so I tend to focus on this distinction between competence and integrity, not only because they can be more easily differentiated in situations, but we often see the world in those terms, and they tend to be perhaps the 2 most important bases of trust. So the other reason why I focus on those 2 dimensions is we process information about those dimensions quite differently. So it turns out we're not neutral jurors when we think about this information.
But we think we are.
We think we are. Exactly. So when it comes to matters of competence, we tend to weigh negative information about competence much less heavily than positive information about competence. And that's great for us in many ways. So you screw up once and then you do very well afterwards. Let's say you're a baseball player, you strike out once and then you hit a home run. They're going to focus on the fact that you hit a home run. You are a home run hitter, right? That one instance of a strikeout is completely discounted. So that positive information is more diagnostic than negative information. But for matters of integrity, that asymmetry is completely reversed. So if you cheat on your spouse once and you say, well, I didn't cheat on you yesterday, that's not going to go over so well, right? So it's that one negative instance, the information about integrity is considered so diagnostic that it overwhelms anything that might be signaled on the positive domain, that you didn't do something bad later. We expect people to behave in an appropriate way. So that's not very informative. There's all sorts of reasons why you might not steal or cheat or assault someone. But so that negative instance is considered very informative to us. And so a lot of my work, especially my early work, looked at those asymmetries and what are the implications of those asymmetries for how we deal with these situations.
There's so much to unpack there. And I think it's really interesting that there is a difference between how we perceive a trust violation that we sort of put into this bucket of that was a competence. That was oops, you didn't know better. That was an error. That was a one-off. It's not because you had bad intent versus, oh, this is a sign that you're lacking in moral clarity or ethical strength. And that difference in understanding really impacts how we receive apologies. And this to me is so interesting because we live in this age where when somebody gets caught who has some sort of a public role and they apologize, we see really interesting effects of those apologies that are explained by your research. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the difference in how we receive apologies based on whether we assess it as a competence violation versus an integrity violation.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing about apologies and, a lot of responses is that they are not pure signals. They actually signal multiple things. In the case of an apology, it conveys the sentiment that you are remorseful and you want to avoid that kind of behavior moving forward. And so that's a positive signal. But it also confirms guilt, which is a negative signal. And so the question for someone who receives an apology is, which of those signals do you weigh more heavily? And that's where the type of violation matters so much, right? So we talked about these asymmetries and whether we weigh positive or negative information depending on the type of violation. Well, so for a competence-based violation, an apology can be very useful because that positive signal that you are remorseful, you're going to address this moving forward, that's considered very diagnostic, much more so than the negative signal of guilt. But when it becomes a matter of integrity, again, that asymmetry is reversed so that all we focus on is the fact that you are confirming that you are guilty, that you lack integrity. And any promise that you're going to avoid this in the future will be discounted. Help.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And you share so many examples, people who haven't lived under a rock will find familiar in your book. But you can even just see the difference in how, depending on what political party you affiliate with, how you receive, for example, Donald Trump's apology when the Access Hollywood footage became public versus when Anthony Weiner's had texted photos of himself and when he apologized for that. So the public's response varied based on political affiliations. I wonder if you can say something about how do we make those assessments based on how we affiliate with the person, whether they're in-group or out-group member.
That really gets to a major question that most of us ignore. And so what happens after something bad has happened? So a violation is we focus on whether or not someone's going to apologize or not. And we have complete blinders quite often regarding this question of why did it happen? And it gets to the fact that most violations are not so clear cut. There can be shades of gray. You can see the same incident as a matter of competence or as a matter of integrity. And many violations are multiply determined. So they can contain elements of both competence and integrity. So, why did you not know something? Well, maybe you didn't bother to prepare, right? So there's an element of intent there as well as a matter of ignorance, right? So you can, focus on one aspect or the other aspect of that reason and then very quickly categorize this as a matter of competence or integrity. And this is where there's an enormous arena that is largely overlooked. How do you view this incident? And that can be determined in multiple ways. One of the ways it's determined is that we tend to make knee-jerk assumptions about why something happened, and we're far less inclined to make the attribution that this was a matter of its competence when that violator is part of an outgroup. If they're not like us, we don't have any stake in maintaining the relationship with them. It's easy to say that they are unethical people. That's why it occurred. And basically, once we make that attribution, there's essentially nothing they can do. An apology simply won't work. But if they're part of our in-group, we often have a motivation to preserve those relationships. So we're more inclined to make the attribution that it was a mistake. They just lack the guidance, right? And so that becomes a matter of competence. And so that same apology can be much more effective.
I'm really picky about which podcasts I spend time listening to because I have precious little free time in my busy family life. But I have discovered Silver Linings Handbook, a podcast that captures the intersection of some of my biggest interests: true crime, cults, and the psychology of being perpetrator and victim. What I love about this podcast is how the host, Jason Blair, goes deeper than the sensationalism of the stories. He treats the people involved with deep compassion instead of a salacious headline. Blair is sensitive to the ethics of reporting on true crime and is truly seeking understanding of humanity. I'm listening to his interview with the man who was romantically involved with leader of the Mother of God cult, Amy Carlson. It's fascinating to hear a long-form interview with someone so deeply involved in an experience most of us could never imagine. If you love Psychologists Off the Clock, I bet you'll love Silver Linings Handbook. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app or at www.silverliningspod.com/POTC.
Oh my gosh, I have a new favorite thing that makes me laugh and smile every single day, and I cannot wait to give it as a gift this holiday season. It's my new Aura frame. With Aura, you can upload unlimited photos and video from your computer or phone, and you can add users who can also add their own photos and videos. Just this morning, I got to walk down memory lane when a baby picture of my nephew in a tuxedo popped up in the rotation. And another thing I'm super excited about is you can preload photos when you give Aura as a gift. My dad is going to be so surprised when we dig up some fun and maybe a little embarrassing shots to put on his this Christmas. For a limited time, visit auraframes.com and get $45 off Aura's best-selling Carver matte frames named #1 by Wirecutter by using promo code POTC at checkout. That's auraframes.com, promo code POTC. This exclusive Black Friday Cyber Monday deal is their best of the year, so order now before it ends. Support the show by mentioning us at checkout. Terms and conditions apply.
Yeah, it's so interesting because if you put together this piece that you're identifying, that apologies carry these two components. We usually only focus on the remorse piece, but there's also this admission of guilt piece. So apologies themselves are more multifaceted than we realize. And the violation itself, whatever was done wrong, whether it was an affair or embezzlement or jaywalking, probably had a lot of factors that went into it. It might have been an error. It might have been something that was more about like a character lapse of like, I didn't put the attention, even though I knew that I should have, into, planning carefully or being thoughtful. And so what we do in our social perception is we can't sort of tolerate all of that complexity. So we narrow in on what is most useful to us. And I think you're highlighting this really important piece that a lot of it is motivated by whether we have incentive to protect the relationship with the person who violated our trust. And if they're in the out group, there's far less incentive to do that. If they're in our in group, we're far more intrinsically motivated to do that. Is that right?
I think that's right. And the other part of the incentive is whether or not you'll even investigate why. And so we will very quickly put, a label on why something happened, whether it was, them lacking principles and being unethical or them making a mistake or just not knowing. But if many violations are in that area of gray, then there is value in investigating, well, to what extent was it influenced by one or the other or both? And if that's the case, then this willingness to investigate, to spend the time to determine the elements that were related to competence, the elements that were related to integrity, it's an important way to help hone in on why something happened. But of course, we don't have the time or energy and often the inclination to do that well.
And I think in the moment, it often feels easier, like more efficient, but also safer to just say, oh, well, that person is a bad person and it's not worth exploring. But I think your point is so important and is something I think a lot about in the couples therapy room, for example, which is we miss a lot of information that could be really useful to building bridges. And even if that particular relationship isn't important to you, or you decide like, I don't necessarily need to be close to this person, that we often end up sort of shutting ourselves down from thinking in more complex and nuanced ways and create like these more reductive worlds that ultimately are more harmful for us individually, but like also for society.
I have very little expertise in the clinical realm, but my understanding is that one of the things that is often done after betrayal is an effort to get the couple to engage in a conversation about each side's responsibility and what happened, right? And I think that relates to what we're talking about in the sense that if you don't do that, then it can be very quickly categorized as, hey, you took advantage. You were trying to get away with something and you can't be trusted because you are a bad person, essentially. But once you start investigating, what are the things that went into what happened? Then you have a better understanding of to what extent did they feel abandoned? Did they feel, to what extent was it a matter of the situation having some influence, maybe not influence to sort of explain all the behavior, but to the extent that you can isolate, what are the things that each side might have done to lead to that behavior? Now you're no longer bucketing this as a pure integrity issue. And through that parsing, you can identify, all right, if there are things that are beyond one's that weren't an intentional that, to try to get away with something that can be explained by other things, then there's hope, at least in the sense that those other things might be things you can control, right? To protect yourself, to prevent these things from happening again. Maybe not with that person. Maybe it's too late with that person, but in the future, are there behaviors that you can control to affect the situation so that you'll retain some control in what happens in the future? That could be valuable too.
Yeah, as I was reading your book, I was thinking that like a lot of what therapy is with a couple who's coming in to try to repair after a betrayal is to try to transform a black and white assessment of this was because of an integrity violation into something that is more of a competence violation, and then figuring out like if it was incompetence and if this was sort of a mistake and you are generally a good and benevolent person, how do you build up the skills so that the person who was harmed won't be in danger anymore? But some people might think that that in and of itself is putting the person who has been harmed, it's keeping them in harm's way, and it's asking them to take responsibility for something that isn't their responsibility. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so it brings us back to the paradox that you raised earlier, right? And there's always that risk. Trust is about being willing to undertake some of that risk. Sometimes it's not warranted, right? And sometimes that person committed the betrayal might not be someone that you feel comfortable making yourself vulnerable to again. But what we know is that if you don't investigate this and make that determination through a careful assessment of all of the things that might have gone, then you are making that decision premature, right? And so I think there is value to that, especially in couples that you deal with every day, because they have a stake here, right? They have invested a lot of time and effort into that relationship. There should be a motivation to at least explore why. And then the outcome, will probably differ based on the person. But this is the same dilemma that we face in all sorts of relationships. It's also the dilemma that we face with those that have been convicted of crimes, right? Like we have a society that essentially throws these people away. And some of them may be irredeemable. It's certainly true, right? And we don't want to just wash away the crimes and pretend like, hey, it's easy to commit and that, it's not a big deal, right? So there should be consequences. But if we aren't open to the possibility that they can redeem themselves, then we have a major problem in society, right? And our prisons are overwhelmed by people that have been thrown in for crimes that they committed before their brains are fully developed, right? Like juveniles who are, and are they really bad people, or were they influenced in the wrong direction at a time when they were maximally vulnerable to this sort of thing? And can they course correct, right? And so I do think this is a fundamental problem that we struggle with in many walks of life. I don't have the answer to what should be done, but what I do know is that we are too eager to end these relationships and throw people away without doing the work first. And I think, one of the reasons I wrote the book is to just underscore the responsibility that we have, right? It's not just the violator's responsibility to fix things. We have a responsibility as those who are witnessing what happened, who are victims, who are, third-party observers, right? That had nothing to do with these situations, to make these judgments carefully, because real lives are at stake and there are real consequences to us as a society if we don't do this well.
Yeah. That is so profound. I almost just want to sit in silence for a second and just let that sink in, because I think we all have that responsibility to think in more complex, nuanced ways rather than to allow our more reductive mental reflexes to take over, because that is kind of instinctual for us. We have this gut response of oh, I don't like what that person did. They're bad. They're the bad kind of person. And then we do, prisons are sort of an extreme example of that, but we can really throw people away and say, well, they're toxic. They're not worth thinking about. And it's unhealthy on so many levels, but as a society, we can kind of see that tendency growing ever more strong. One interesting thing that I think it comes out of the research with the criminal justice population is that most people who are incarcerated don't see themselves as having committed integrity violations. They see it more as competence violations, that there's like a reason, there's sort of like this neutralization theory. People sort of understand their own criminal activity more situationally, whereas somebody else who's not encountered the same challenges or, isn't in the criminal justice system is more likely to view it as an integrity violation. And so there is this real difference in how we're likely to assess our own transgressions versus other people's that I think is really important to be aware of, because it is so reflexive to make that judgment of like good and bad. And usually like you're on the good side and people that you're close to are on the good side, and people that are more far away from you who have done things that look transgressive are much more easy to categorize in a bad.
So there's something that a very well-known phenomenon is called the fundamental attribution error, right? So something bad happens. It has to be because of that person. There's something related to that person that caused this, whereas the people who are actually engaging in that behavior, they're very attuned to all the situational pressures that led to that behavior. And so I think that's true. And the other thing this relates to, when we get to this question of, is this a matter of them lacking integrity? We need to explore this question of what does integrity even mean, right? Because it seems like a simple concept. Do they have ethics or not? But when you dive into the research on ethics and morality, it becomes a far murkier situation, because the evidence indicates that we all share the same set of principles, about 5 core principles. But where it gets complicated is that we weigh these principles differently in different situations, and different cultures will weigh these principles differently. Depending on your political affiliation, you'll weigh these principles differently, and so on. And so what happens quite often, especially in these polarized political times, is that you see someone doing something that you wouldn't do, you don't consider appropriate, because you have a certain set of ethical principles. And so you infer that what you believe in is right, and so what they believe in is wrong, right? But it turns out that we all share the same set of ethical principles, but the issue is weighing these principles differently. It stops being a matter of right and wrong. It becomes a thornier problem. It becomes right versus right. And so how do you address this? It turns out that if we see this as right versus wrong, we're not interested in engaging with that other person, having a dialogue. What we want to do is impose our value systems on them. So it becomes less about dialogue and it becomes more about domination, right? Our imposing our value system on them, they feel unfairly maligned because they don't think they've done something wrong. And so they chafe at the accusation, and they try to impose their value system on us, right? Each side sees the other side as evil, wrong, unethical, and so on. And so we get nowhere. If you recognize that situations are murky, it becomes this matter of when the rubber hits the road and you have to choose between feeding your family versus following this particular rule or law, like then it gets a little more complicated, right? And then we start recognizing that this is not so simple, and we can then become more open to a dialogue of, all right, so how do you manage these horrible gray areas, these impossible trade-offs, right? That's where real dialogue can happen. And that's where you can make progress. But we don't get there because we never see this as about right versus right. It's about right versus wrong. And as a result, that conversation stops. It only becomes, you're a bad person. You either do it my way or find the highway. And that's pretty much it.
You're getting to such a core issue that is really contributing to where we're at as a society, so divided, and also really, what creates a lot of close relationships in the most painful of ways. I am curious what your thoughts are, and how do you move from that position of one person trying to put their morality onto the other, and because they feel right and they feel absolutely certain that the other person is wrong. How do we pivot that conversation in a way that helps people to rebuild trust And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that at the societal level. I'm not asking you to solve all of society's problems, but I am curious, like based on your research, like what is the way to pivot the conversation that feels so stuck, so entrapped?
Well, let me preface this by saying that I'm not done with my research. I don't have the answers yet. But with that said, I had some conversations with this institute in Canada that was working on a white paper on misinformation and in some of these issues. And one of the things that I try to impress upon them is, part of the problem is when people feel like their values are being dismissed. And so if you're in this situation, the inclination is to say, well, that's stupid. Like that's not nearly as important as what I care about. I would encourage people to respond with, that's important too. And recognize that their values matter, that there are legitimate concerns, and then start asking questions. And so your concerns are legitimate, and I hear you. I'd love to uphold that principle, whatever that might be. What I'd also like to do is uphold this other principle. And I'd love to talk to you about how we could do both. Okay? How do we thread the needle? Start asking questions based on the presumption that both value systems might be worth maintaining, because they do tend to stem from the same shared values, right? And then and present this as a matter of how do we figure this trade-off, right? Like it becomes a problem to be solved, and maybe we can work it out together. And maybe we don't have the power to solve the world, but we can at least come to an agreement that these values do matter, yours and mine, and maybe we would have some ideas that would at least resolve the rift between us.
I love that. I mean, it almost sounds like part of what you're recommending is that we begin to see people who have, on the opposite side, who have violated our trust either personally or more broadly, abstractly, as people with integrity, even if it's integrity that may differ from the specific values that we most want to highlight, to sort of start with that assumption of some goodness, even if you disagree, and to be curious about how you can find some balance between what's important to you and what's important to them. And in a sense, it's like exiting the right versus wrong and entering in that we might both be right, and there might still be difficulty in honoring the two different things that we both value that are different. But could we be collaborators in figuring out how to honor what's important to each of us? And that is not easy to do, but isn't that much more productive than saying, I'm right and you're wrong? And hey, even if you are right, I'm saying this to myself, I'm saying this to everybody, even if you are right, if that sets up an adversarial situation that's going to end up with winners and losers, like that's no good for society anyway. We just end up with a lot of unhappy people who are not going to, then be our collaborators.
It makes me think of something that happened not too long ago. A neighbor of mine, someone that I admire greatly. He is very civic minded, and he's been going to a lot of protests about what's been happening in this country. And so he shows up, and he and others are, protesting a lot of the stuff that's going on in the administration. And someone showed up who was clearly in favor of a lot of the policies the Trump administration was doing. And he shows up with an American flag, right? Huge American flag. And my neighbor said, well, we should have those too. They each believed in the ideals of America. The issue is where the rubber hits the road. Like, how do you make these difficult trade-offs? How do you deal with the fact that we never have enough resources to solve all the things we want to solve, right? And so how do you make those choices? And each person will do that differently. But if you can start with the fact that, yeah, we want the same thing. We all have the same core values. And then it just becomes a matter of how you address that. Well, that becomes a negotiation, right? And that's something I teach, in my day job. But negotiations are tractable, whereas these fights over values of right, wrong, they become intractable. They really become about who wins.
And at the core of it, we have to trust the other person enough to feel like they're willing to engage with some good faith in the negotiation. So it's like, that's the good place to land, but we do need to sort of do our own work and invite the other person to help us with that work of rebuilding trust so that those negotiations can happen. I mean, you think about these regional conflicts where on both sides, there's just no faith at all that the other side will engage with any kind of a good faith intent. And so you can't get to the part of negotiation because there's no trust. And so, I do kind of wonder about like, how do we rebuild trust in these situations where like that sense of the integrity has really been damaged. And you could say beyond repair, except like there's no option for that. Like, we have to live with one another.
Yeah, it relates to the conversation that I had with this institute, and they were bringing up the fact that there are deliberate attempts at misinformation, especially with respect to the environment and global warming and things like that. And the concern was that it's not an honest conversation. And what I pointed out to them was that, it stems from something important. It stems from the belief that the other side was not engaging in honest conversation. And so we have an extraordinary deficit in trust. And so when that's in place, then you feel entitled to be dishonest because the other side has been dishonest and will continue to be dishonest.
Which then just proves that they shouldn't think that you're honest and that you shouldn't think that they're honest. It creates like a building of this lack of trust, more and more evidence.
Yeah. So there's this vicious cycle, and that's not easy to overcome, right? So the starting point is to start acknowledging that the concerns are real. So when someone denies global warming, it may be because they're terrified about what the policies will do for their farm and their family and their ability to stay afloat, right? Those are legitimate concerns. And we don't talk about that enough. And so as we start talking about those things and saying, you are right, those are things that we need to pay more attention to. Now, suddenly the narrative has changed. They can't say that we are, the left is just making up things to pursue a policy that's impractical and will have devastating effects on families. They can't make that argument anymore. They will recognize that there is an honest attempt to consider the concerns of the other side, and there's a natural reciprocity effect that occurs, right? When you feel like you've been heard, then you feel compelled to hear the other side as well. It's a natural thing for you to reciprocate, that courtesy. Don't you want to maintain this kind of conversation that, we've initiated while we're listening to each other's sides? That helps, right? It may not be a panacea, but it can start the ball rolling and at least get us on that track, right? And then start the process. That will probably take a lot of time, but at least we will be on the right path.
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot of time because of something that you're saying that makes me think of this construct of psychological safety. It's like, how can we trust and how can the other person trust us if we don't feel safe? And part of what you're saying is that if we want the quote other side to engage with us in an honest, good faith way, we have to do our part in making safe. And that's not easy to do if we feel like they've made us unsafe, but it has to start somewhere. And it can be slower, but I'm just thinking about There's this terrific movie that has nothing to do with humans. Well, it has something to do with humans, called My Octopus Teacher.
Oh, I saw it. I loved it.
Oh, beautiful. And the first line is, this movie is a must watch. So to all the listeners out there, you should watch it. It's really beautiful. It's on Netflix. But it is this documentarian who was burned out of work and decided to pursue this project of visiting this little octopus that he encountered on a deep water cold dive. And he decides to visit her every single day. And initially, she's really afraid of him. And he says, we always think octopuses are like aliens from another world, that we could never sort of understand them. But he goes out of his way to help her to feel safe with him. And it takes a lot of work, a lot of effort. He has a couple mishaps where he startles her and she is very afraid. And then he has to work to rebuild the trust. But through that work, they develop this really beautiful, deep, intimate relationship. And it's not related to what's happening in politics, but it just seems to me that we can take away from that example that we need to make other people feel safe if we are to hope for them to engage authentically with us. That is our responsibility. And I think in the conversation about trust, we often think about what the other person has done, and we forget that we play a role too.
That's perfectly said. I think that's a key step to get the ball rolling.
Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my site softer?
Can I make my site firmer?
Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side. Your Sleep Number setting. Enjoy personalized comfort for better sleep night after night. It's our Black Friday sale. Recharge this season with a bundle of cozy, soothing comfort. Now only $17.99 for our C2 mattress and base, plus free premium delivery. Prices higher in Alaska and Hawaii. Check it out at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com today.
I just set up all my financial accounts at Monarch, and I am so pleased with how unbelievably easy it was. I totally get why users and financial experts are in love with Monarch. You will feel organized and confident in your finances with Monarch, an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean interface on your laptop or your phone. And right now, just for our listeners, Monarch is offering 50% off your first year with code OFFTHECLOCK at monarch.com. Before Monarch, our family finances felt like they were all over the place, and we never really had an accurate picture of our assets and liabilities at any given moment. And now with Monarch, we finally do. We actually feel like grown-ups. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code OFFTHECLOCK at monarch.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code OFFTHECLOCK. And remember, when you support our sponsors, you're supporting the podcast.
So the way that we might respond to an apology that seems to come out of an integrity violation is that we just hate the person more. Is that a glitch in our brain, or is that something that's more like external structures? How do we change that if it is in our brain? And if it's not, then what is it that we need to change about the incentive structure?
I think it's a glitch in our brain. It's like the third rail of trust. And it's an issue I've been working on for well over 20 years now. So I wrote the book, and after 20 years of research, it's now like 25 years. It's unclear what we can do about this. If you believe someone committed an integrity-based violation, you can apologize, you can offer financial compensation, you can institute all these regulatory systems, you can do all this stuff, and we still have a hard time overcoming this fact that they have confirmed that they lack integrity. And that's more diagnostic than anything. How do you shift how the situation is framed? Can you articulate aspects of the situation that make it less of a clear-cut integrity violation? And are there narratives that we have that we can develop to help underscore the possibility that even bad people can recognize the error of their ways, right? So an expression that I love is, it was an error in judgment. What does that mean, right? And so I did something bad, I made a judgment to do that, but it was a competence-based violation. I made a bad call, right? And that is like a beautiful phrase in a way, because I hear it used, and it is true. People can make bad calls. And I think one of the things that we might do in society is to think about, like, what is that path to someone who's made bad calls to redeem themselves? I think it's a major question for the criminal justice system. Like what do we do about that, right? And at what point are there debts to society paid? I don't have simple answers to this, but I think that is the big question that we need to take and resolve.
That's such a beautiful place to end, because it's like a shift of the question. Like, rather than does this person lack integrity or not, or what's the cause of their error, it's the question of like, how can we rebuild trust? How can we allow them to redeem themselves? And even if that's not an easy question to answer, it's such a forward-looking, healing question, as opposed to one it's like a growth mindset question versus like, we're done here. And that just seems so much healthier for society and for all of our relationships, because there will be fractures. People will make mistakes. People will have errors in judgment.
Yeah, one of the things that I've thought about off and on is an old practice called banishment. Right. So this is something that we don't do anymore. We can't really do. But what does banishment entail? That you've done something so bad that you can't be part of our society, but we're letting you move on, and we're not foreclosing the possibility that you can enter a different society and become a whole person again. Right. Like, it may be too late for us, that you can move forward.
Thank you so much. This was such an incredible conversation. Your book is incredible. I highly recommend it. It's clear that your framework and your research has so many broad applications for understanding trust violations across contexts. And I really am so grateful to have had the chance to chat with you. And I'll leave you with just one more question, which is, where can people go to find out more from you?
Sure. So I have a website, peterhkim.com, and M as in Monday. And so that's up and has, a bunch of my podcast interviews. I'll post this when it's available and so on. And yeah, so that contain a bunch of things related to me.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for your really thoughtful question.
Hey, listeners, I'm so excited to be here with Michael to do our co-host post on how trust works, the science of how relationships are built, broken, and repaired. And I just have to share, and listeners will probably already know, that I am a huge fan of Peter Kim's research and writing, and trust issues are something that comes up all the time in the couples therapy room. Often people are coming in after an affair disclosure, but often they're coming in after smaller betrayals. And so rebuilding trust and really figuring out how to do that in a way that is safe for the person who has been hurt, possible for the person who has caused the harm, is really something that is important. And there were so many gems in this interview, but one of my favorite ones was his comment that trust is not just a violator's responsibility, that it requires all parties involved to do the rebuilding. So that's something that I keep coming back to. And Michael, I am dying to know what you thought of this conversation.
This was a brilliant conversation about this moment you just mentioned. This was when I paused listening to the episode and I made a note that I wanted to address this in our discussion. And both of you talked about trust also being like a behavior. And I think that is so important to acknowledge that first and foremost, trust shows up in the ways that we behave. And a mentor of mine once told me that if you want to learn to trust people, you have to start by trusting people. And just because you get good at trusting people doesn't mean that you might not have that trust betrayed, either willingly or by accident. It just can still happen. But if you want to learn to trust, you have to start by trusting people. And as we're nearing the end of 2025, one of my resolutions for the next year is to trust my friends more in a very specific, I mean, I trust my friends, of course, but there is one domain in my life that is a pet peeve of mine, and that is when friends of mine invite us to go to a venue that I don't know. And my immediate question is this venue wheelchair accessible? And then they go ahead and they research and think, yeah, it's fine. And then I do my research because there's these little details that people that don't use a wheelchair don't look out for. And so I double check. And it's quite annoying because it costs me time. And also I want to just like everyone else be like, thanks for the invite, I'm coming, and let that be it. And so that's what I'm going to do in 2026. And it is going to push me outside of my comfort zone. It's going to be some exposure to just trust my friends that they're going to handle this and that they're thinking of me and that they make sure that it's going to be wheelchair accessible. So it's going to be exposure work for me. And it is going to be, I mean, in the cases where they overlook something, it is not a betrayal in regards to their integrity. It is just a failure of their competency, which is going to make both sides win because they will train their competency and they will know finally after partying with me for so many years, they'll finally know what to look for because I allow them to make a couple of mistakes. And I, on the other hand, allow myself to just trust and see that it goes well.
I love that as a resolution. And I invite all of the listeners to think about ways that they can practice doing more trust and that recognition that it may come with some growing pains. It's sort of like the idea of when we micromanage other people, it is because we don't trust them. But when we do that, we interfere with their process of learning, right? So if you're constantly doing the job for your friends, they're not learning how to be good friends on your back. But it is true that if you don't help them out, there may be some growing pains that they have to go through, and that's going to cost you too. But if you see it as a competence violation and an opportunity for them and for you to grow as individuals and as friends, then it's such a powerful thing. So I love that example.
Al, can I throw a question your way, actually, in regards to the trust issue? Because I know I'm talking to an expert here. And my question that I sort of worked on going through the interview was the idea of two people in your regard as a relationship therapist. For example, I could imagine that you work with people that go through a divorce, and then you have a situation where ideally both parties would trust each other to do the right thing. But at the same time, I could see how in a situation like that, the person that trusts more is maybe at a disadvantage. It's a little bit like the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, where if I trust the other person, but the other person is abusing my trust, I'm losing big time. How would one approach a situation like that?
Well, you bringing up game theory is actually the perfect thing to bring up because it's a little bit of an empirical question of like, how much is the right amount to trust if we're not really sure whether the other person is going to meet us there? And what researchers have found is that on average, the best thing to do is what researchers call generous tit for tat. So we kind of meet other people where they're, but be a little bit more generous than we think other people have earned the right to receive. And the reason for that is that in a noisy system, meaning that in a world where we misread one another, where people have bad days, and so they don't operate in the best version of themselves at all times, that being a little bit more generous than we think is warranted is good for relationships and is good for us because the vast majority of humans have this social reciprocity where if somebody is kind to us, we're much more likely to be kind back. If somebody is trusting towards us, we're much more likely to meet that trust in a reciprocal way. And so being a little bit more generous than we think is warranted is quite helpful for relationships and for cooperation. And then your question about like what happens if that is coming at the tail end of a betrayal is that you have to repair the trust first in order to feel safe enough to do that kind of generosity. And that's something, of course, that we do a lot in couples therapy, but it is certainly something that you can do, recognizing that trust is built on feeling safe enough to be vulnerable with somebody. And that can be a conversation that you with somebody who has harmed you. I'd like to try to resume this experience of feeling safe enough to collaborate with you. And how can we collaborate in arriving at that place together? So that's a great question. And I hope that folks try out some of these ideas and think about this difference of integrity violations versus competence violations, and that folks really think about trust as something that we build together.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.